Bona tarda a tothom. Benvinguts a la sessió Aigua i Democràcia, límits i reptes per la governança d'un bé comú. Aquesta sessió la farem en anglès, d'acord? Hi ha una invitada de Regne Unit. Em comenten que hi ha servei de traducció per qui ho necessiti, al fons, d'anglès al català, d'acord? So, welcome everybody and thank you to be here. It's a pleasure to have two exceptional invited speakers to talk about water, democracy, and technology and conflicts around the resource. So on my left side we have Katie Meehan from King's College. She's professor on environmental justice and co-director of King's Water Center. She's a geographer, although she's trained as kind of interdisciplinary water policy expert. Currently, she got a prestigious grant, an ERC grant from the British government, well, Europe, but well, kind of Brexit thing, so juggling with the two geographies. An exceptional project called Plumbing Poverty, so I just recommend you to check on her latest work. Probably we will talk a little bit about that. And more on the left side, we have Dr. Violeta Cabello. Violeta is a postdoctoral researcher at the Basque Center for Climate Change, BC3. She has explored water governance problems in southeastern Spain with a special focus on water uses for agricultural production. And in the recent years, she has focused on environmental conflicts in Mar Menor, in Murcia, and probably we will also, these conflicts and issues around water in Mar Menor in Murcia will also come up on our discussion. So I will do just a very quick introduction. I would like to start it's a typical start that some water political ecologists do, but thinking about a glass of water, right? I mean, how a glass of water, how tap water that is filling this glass arrives to our homes, right? I mean, I'm thinking through the case of Barcelona. When we open a tap in Barcelona, we need to think underneath the city and beyond the city to understand the complex geographies and processes that bring water to our taps. On the one hand, beyond the city, because as we know, the technological networks that bring water to our homes spans, in our case, to the Pyrenees, right? I mean, and although in the past few years, the water scarcity and drought and the climate emergency has vividly impacted water flows in the Pyrenees. This is a very important geography for the water supply in Barcelona. So thinking beyond the city is very important when thinking about water, especially because many conflicts around water play out beyond the urban borders. But in our case, in Barcelona, also we need to think about all the technological arrangements and new technologies that foster water supply and ensure water supply in our city. We have to think that at this point, in this very moment, that we have been experiencing a kind of very harsh drought for the past 3 years. Almost half of the water that comes through our taps does not come directly from the Pyrenees, but comes either from desalination plants and from regeneration plants, meaning water that is wastewater, that it's treated and it's pumped upstream the river. So in this case, in Barcelona, technological assemblages and technosolutionism is very important in a way to understand how water continues to flow through our taps, even though the climate emergency is intersecting very vividly with the materiality of the resource. And not only that, we need also to think about the complex and contested political processes behind the water supply. We will talk much about that, but we have to think just through the case of Barcelona that in the past few years we have gone through a remunicipalization struggle that had not materialized, but although spur intense debates where democracy was put on the table and try to articulate alternative to the current water supply schemes. And also we need to think that a cascade of different crises, including the COVID crisis, has put on the table another issue, which is water poverty, echoing also energy poverty. So water poverty, to some extent, also has been touching the debates on water governance in the city. So the case of Barcelona, although it has its particularities, I think it's a good lens or a good starting point to start thinking about some concepts like scarcity, like water conflicts, water struggles, and also to think about alternative futures and in a context of climate emergency. So I would like to start with the notion of scarcity, which is not the same as drought, as we will see. So scarcity is a concept, right, that appears here and there, and at the same time should push us to think why some scarce prone areas have abundant water sources and supplies, while other abundant geographies do not have proper water access for most of the citizens. So this is one of the first question of I would like you to throw in the air, and Katie, how do you understand scarcity through your research?
Thank you, Ug. I'll just, before I get to scarcity, I'll just give a little bit of background so you know where I'm coming from. I'm the director of the Plumbing Poverty Project, which is an ERC project. It's a 5-year study that examines water insecurity at the household scale, at the domestic level. And my earlier work, I've worked in this area for a long time. My earlier work focused on Mexico. And usually when I talk to people, they're like, yeah, I could see that. There are many households in Mexico that don't have safe, reliable, affordable running water. But I was really interested in how insecurity was produced in the places that we might least expect. The United States, where I'm from, but also countries in Europe, these places where we assume a sort of developed ethos or environment that doesn't have water poverty problems anymore, but it does. And really kind of the impetus behind my career has always been to understand the conditions that produce social and environmental injustice, especially at the domestic scale, which is often hidden from view. They don't, we don't benefit from seeing giant dams or other large-scale water infrastructures, within the household. And to ask a seemingly very simple but important question, in a world with so much technological innovation and wealth, why does inequality still persist? Why in many advanced economies like Spain, but also the US and elsewhere, is it widening and actually getting worse? And we have to understand that in order to ask the very important follow-up question, which is, then what do we do about it? So I really want to kind of piggyback on this idea of scarcity and maybe be a little provocative to say that, as I drop my papers, that scarcity is produced. It's not automatic. It's not just found out there in the environment. What do I mean by that? I'll start with a little example from Arizona, which is a very dry desert state in the southwestern United States and my former home. And in terms of water supply, Arizona is heavily dependent on groundwater and a few major rivers, such as the Colorado River, which produces water for agriculture and cities all throughout the U.S. Southwest and also northwestern Mexico. Climate change is forecast to radically transform this region. Already this year, I think Phoenix broke a record where they experienced over 100 days at over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 38 degrees Celsius. I mean, imagine that heat. That is painful. Our research team, the plumbing poverty team, has done a lot of kind of big data analysis as well as kind of small data analysis. And in the Phoenix metro area, there's roughly 5,300 households without reliable running water, either from a physical lack of infrastructure or the inability to pay and experiencing a water service shutoff. And these numbers have not really changed much in the past 2 decades, despite the city expanding. And if anything, they're really an underestimation because our data do not count people who experience homelessness or people of color. They undercount people of color. And we did analysis of the top 50 largest US cities, which have over half the US population. And in some of the wealthiest and fastest growing cities in the US, rates of plumbing poverty are only getting worse. How is this possible in a place with so much technological prowess and wealth? And I think that's the kind of question that I'm really driving out. It's actually not really about plumbing at all. It's about social and spatial relationships. And when you look across kind of Arizona, the situation begins to, you can see how it's even worse. For example, on the Navajo Nation, indigenous people are 2 to 3 times more likely to lack running water in their homes. Similarly, along the US-Mexico border in the city of Nogales, Arizona, there are low-income communities called colonias that experience a lack of infrastructure, institutional support, and secure and affordable water for many decades, almost since their settlement. And in many ways, when we think about this, the day zero, this kind of experience in Cape Town that received a lot of media publication that, you know, people in the US and Mexico refer to as the coming water crisis, there are many communities where day zero has always been on the radar. It has always been a current experience. They have always experienced the sharp end of insecurity and what we might call scarcity. And when you look at a place like Arizona, there's still quite a bit of water flowing to, for example, mining operations, to large agricultural operations that grow cattle for export, to sod farms growing grass for soccer pitches. There's a great cliche in Arizona that water flows uphill to money, and 3 things, the 3 C's. You can test me on this, Casey. Cows, cattle, and copper. And so there's plenty of water. It just, where is it going? Who's controlling these flows? What are the conditions that legal, institutional, social, ecological, that produce flows of water that are not scarce for some and scarce for others? When I went home maybe about a year and a half ago back to Arizona to visit family, and I'm a big mountain biker. And I was out in southeastern Arizona in an area called Patagonia, you know, riding through the woods, and all of a sudden I was stopped by security guards outside a large mining operation. That was really, I mean, it was massive. It was kind of shocking, actually. And they diverted me. And it's run by an Australian multinational mining firm called, I can't kid you, Hermosa. And Hermosa was actually strip mining for precious metals, you know, that go in our car batteries and our phones, whatnot. And mining operations use tons of water, actually, and they leave really unhealthy waters behind in terms of legacies for the environment. And it just kind of, you know, it was such a stark illustration that you can't avoid this even on your holiday. Where water goes and who it's plentiful for, even in a desert, and where and who it's scarce for. And so I think the take-home point out of all this is that scarcity is manufactured, even in a desert. And I think we should start by asking who and where and what experiences scarcity and who does not. And I think that'll help us kind of ask the why question that then kind of unlocks or opens possibilities to change or transform that.
Violeta, moving and building on Katie's development of the notion of the production of scarcity, how does your work in Spain help to illuminate how we should understand scarcity in the Spanish context?
Bueno, buena tarde. Voy a decir algo de mí en español y luego cambio. También como por situarme un poco. Yo últimamente me describo como una andaluza de pueblo exiliada en el lluvioso Bilbao. y he tenido como dos experiencias muy distintas de la geografía del agua a nivel personal. And now shift to English. And as you say in the introduction, before I moved to Bilbao, I worked many years on water scarcity problems at the territorial level, what is called the river basin. And at this scale, in most southern regions of Spain, water problems are very connected to agricultural problems because agriculture uses 80% of the water, like as a whole in the Spanish state, but this pattern repeats in most river basins. This is quite an unknown figure. People don't know it. So from my line of work, we often define scarcity as a mismatch between how much water you have, how much water is available, and how much water you need for human uses. And of course, you can have less water available because of a drought, but you can also produce scarcity by increasing water demands, which is exactly what happened in our country for many years. That water authorities have been continuously promoting the expansion of especially irrigation because it has been considered like a central piece of national economic development here and in many other countries of the world. But like for more than a century, we built dams and canals to bring water from water-abundant regions like the north to water-scarce regions like Murcia and the Mar Menor. And these very large infrastructures had tremendous social ecological impacts, obviously on rivers, but also there were thousands and thousands of families displaced because their village, their home was getting flooded. And this is a very silent part of the Spanish history. There's a recent book called Memorias Ahogadas that is one of the first coherent narratives about the lives of those people. Well, in this century, luckily we have new policies in Europe and strategies for managing water have shifted. So now we don't build large dams, although this is still contested. But the new policies mandate that we need to take care of ecosystems and leave certain water in the river because ecosystems have a right to exist as well. No? And so how did water authorities in many river basins balance, environmental protection with continuously expanding irrigation and water demands? Well, obviously by new technologies like desalination, wastewater reuse to create new resources. But this is mostly on the coastline and mostly for urban and industrial uses. And for agriculture, there's been like a massive investment in what is called modernization of irrigation, that is making it more efficient. And this leads to the so-called paradox of efficiency. That is something that is also difficult to understand, but the more you improve efficiency, the more water you consume. And because the savings of water for using less water per plant, you use it for growing more crops, you don't leave them on the river. No? So at the moment we have a situation in which we have many more water resources committed to water users, and this leaves these users very vulnerable to droughts, as the one we just experienced. And in the past years, because of this drought, is the first time I've heard the idea of, or maybe we have limits to growth in the very material sense of extracting more and more water. And we've shifted debates around what it means to have a fair, a just water allocation. I think this discussion is much more advanced in the urban sector than, for instance, when you think about agriculture. Maybe I'll stop here. Yeah.
That's great. I mean, this is very useful because, you have mentioned the notion of limits, right? And how pushing those limits forward and forward also unleashes many conflicts, right? And the notion of conflict is a notion that goes hand in hand with water, and many would say that that water is often portrayed as a resource that people and institutions fight over it, and either through conflicts around water dams. We have many examples throughout the Spanish modern history, right? I mean, dams being as replicating through the territory and modifying the waterscape with the ensuing movements of people massively, and to the point that Spain, together with China, is the country in the world with the highest number of stored water in dams per capita. So it's a kind of, maybe now we have also another country, but to some point it's China and Spain. So Spain has massively reconfigured its waterscape through recasting the nature of rivers, right? And this has spurred conflicts. Also, conflicts may be spurred by water pollution issues, and here's the connection with your work, right, in Mar Menor. I would like to hear more on your more recent research on Mar Menor, and also because Mar Menor, and maybe Katie is not aware of that, but in the past few years, month, has been declared legally as a kind of, has legal entity as a physical person. So it has been a kind of wide struggle that probably Violeta will be able to talk more about that.
Yeah, exactly. It's, the Mar Menor, even if it's located in a semi-arid region, it's not a conflict over water scarcity, but over poorly managed water abundance coming from somewhere else. So this is, well, probably many people here know it, but it's a very large coastal lagoon in Murcia that got famous first, especially in 2019, because it started to throw dead fishes out of the shores, like tons of dead fishes. And recently, it has become famous again because it has become the first ecosystem that is a legal person in Europe. There are many other ecosystems in the world with this kind of protection, but it was the first in Europe. To me, it's a fascinating paradox. So the history of the Mar Menor is very contentious, but everybody agrees on one element that was the starting point, the construction of the Tajo Segura water transfer. So only the expectation that there was going to be to come a huge volume of water, of high quality water, initiated a major transformation of the landscape from small family farming to very large area of intensive agriculture for exportation, but also intensive urbanization in the coastline, like everything together intensified. And like what the problem of the Mar Menor is called eutrophication. And it's a word that social movements started to learn about in 2015, because all this intensification went on like silently until the lagoon in 3 weeks turns green, and everybody was like, what is happening here? So many new platforms were created, and they started to learn, to launch campaigns, to demand actions, obviously, that didn't come very fast. And the eutrophication is a very difficult problem because it needs, what it is an accumulation of nutrients, that is called nitrogen, that comes from fertilizers in agriculture, and phosphorus that comes normally from wastewater from urban areas. So you have many players involved, and the contestation has been around what exact percentage of nutrients am I responsible for? And in 2018, there was a sort of convergence between scientists and environmental movements pointing at agriculture is responsible for 80% of the nutrients. And this triggered a major reaction in the agricultural sector that is obviously very powerful. There are many big companies, cooperatives, but also thousands of farmers' families and thousands of migrants working there, coming from other countries in very precarious conditions, as you may imagine. And the agricultural companies created a foundation that took lobby and counter the narrative of agriculture is the culprit for what is going on. And this foundation has been slowly approaching far-right strategies of misinformation, fake news, fake data, creating a major confusion among the population. So when I arrived there in 2021, and I did 1 year of social research, what I found is that the society was tremendously polarized. So on one side you have a share of the population that considers the lagoon a person with a right to exist, like you and me, and on the other side you have an increasingly share of the population denying any sort of responsibility and material connection. And what is very difficult and very sad is that this also translates in a territorial fracture with coastal communities that have the direct experience of the situation of the lagoon and having to live with an ecosystem that is dying, are in a very tense situation with inland communities that are mostly agrarian and are in this narrative of we're blamed, we're the victims here, and obviously see their livelihood threatened as well. So, yeah.
That's great. Katie, what's your take on the common motto that water is the next oil and the future water wars will be fought over water? What's your take on that?
I think, when I teach, there's usually two narratives that I have to sort of unspool in students' heads. One is the kind of Malthusian trope of overpopulation that's going to ruin the earth. It's been aided by the fact that many countries are shrinking in population, so I don't have to do as much work to convince us that that probably isn't a future we're looking at. The second one is this idea that water is the next oil, that the next world wars will be fought over water. And, the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in Economics, Elinor Ostrom, and all of her comrades did years of work showing that actually water is more often a site of collaboration, of cooperation, by necessity, because you're dealing with very wicked problems with many different types of stakeholders. And we see out in the world more cooperation and collaboration, sometimes reluctantly, but usually eventually, than we see fighting. And for me, I think it just leads to the idea that I think we should retire the water wars trope and really think more seriously about struggle. About who's struggling for water, how those come together, how information is received and circulated, how people connect over water through struggle to kind of change relations and push for change. In my own line of work, I look at really urban water, and I tend to focus on the household level. And I see water really through the lens of labor. And I think that affords me a kind of different way of approaching things. Not just wage labor, but firstly, the unpaid labor that if you don't have secure water supply, that you have to go out and find it, procure it, treat it, manage it. That's a lot of work. Usually I talk to students and say, have you ever gone backpacking and had to lug water with you through a scarce area? You know how heavy this thing is and how much work it is and how you end up having to obsess about it. Where's your next source of water? It involves basically a lot of physical, mental, emotional, and financial work. And for those of us, probably all of us in this room who have piped running water in our homes, that work has really been assumed by a mostly public set of institutions that deliver water to your doorstep, a form of what we would call state-sponsored social reproduction. So either the labor falls unevenly on people who are at the sharpest end of inequality in society. And I think from a labor perspective, that opens up the idea that water struggles are really a kind of form of class conflict. And that might be strange if you haven't heard me talk about that, but it emerges from our unequal water distribution. And it's not a kind of monolithic or unilateral clash, but one that comes out of histories of uneven development and these kind of multiple colliding, overlapping crises that characterize like this current moment. So in research we've done in cities like Portland, Oregon, and Dublin, Ireland, it's no accident that renters, people who are at this point generationally priced out of the housing market, are more likely to live in homes without running water. And they're doing one of two things, we're hypothesizing, either moving into homes with more precarious housing, or they're trying to balance a really tight household budget and they're experiencing water service shutoffs because they can't afford to pay the bill that much. And these are places, both Portland and Dublin, that are often touted as development models for Western countries like the US and Ireland. It's unsurprising that these are also the people who stand up. The people who stand up are the ones who have most to lose, and they're the first ones to get serious about organizing struggles in the face of crises. And I think when we look around, these are the kinds of lessons that we learn from water struggles, like the one in Flint, Michigan, over the lead poisoning, or the Standing Rock protest over the oil pipeline that was threatening indigenous water supplies. And I think this understanding kind of class conflict in this kind of way allows us to see kind of the production of conflict in really different ways than what we imagine when we think about bullets flying over the next world water war, which is just a really tired and stale way of thinking about how conflict is produced and understood by the people most affected by them.
Great. I think we have moved through scarcity, then conflict / cooperation, and maybe in this last part, before we open the floor for questions, we could talk about the future and about hope. In a kind of context of climate emergency, where I mean, in Spain we have observed the hot summer after a hot summer after a hot summer in a row, diminishing available water resources in rivers. And how do you feel, Violeta, about the future, especially through the Spanish lens, especially through your experience and the experience in your geographies about the future of water in Spain in the light of the climate emergency?
Yeah, I don't feel much hope, you know. No, we've been with this joke of hope the whole afternoon. Climate change predictions, at least what they say is that we will have less water available in the future, therefore more scarcity on that side. And therefore we will have potentially more conflicts between leaving the water in the river or extracting it, between using it for agriculture or for Barcelona or other uses, but especially also, I think, between different agrarian users. This will be the most contentious space. So I think at least what I'm concentrating my energy for the next few years is first maintain the protection of aquatic ecosystems, because it's weak, and considering the political trends in Europe where they are going, and also trying to understand ecosystem through new lenses, like the insensibilities, like the person, legal person in the Mar Menor. I think it's very important that we advance concrete proposals of what justice mean in water allocation for agriculture. We are now debating this concept of social distribution. And this obviously leads to questions like, what is the type of agricultural model that we are to protect, and where are we going to cut down allocations, and it leads to trying to differentiate between which is the agriculture that actually sustains rural communities and which is the one that is only seeking for benefit, no matter what the impact they create. No? But this, again, is not an easy discussion. And first, because the agricultural production is very integrated nowadays in global production chains. So the small one produces for the big one that sells to bigger ones in Europe. And it's not that farmers perceive themselves different than agro-industrial lobbies or networks. Second, because the agricultural sector has a very homogeneous discourse, and you saw last year the protests, massive protests in Europe, and in Spain they were really huge. There are very few organizations that demarcate out from the more hegemonic discourse. And obviously there are like Food Sovereignty, La Via Campesina, and many peasant organizations in Catalonia, but not the majority. So we are working on trying to articulate spaces for contested interests between agricultural and environmental organizations. And this is very difficult because we have a long history of confrontation. But there is one example that is called the Mesa Social del Agua de Andalucía that includes farmer unions, cultural, environmental organizations, unions, urban water providers, public urban water providers. So I think this is like a new experiment that has long already 5 years. Yeah, we'll see where it goes.
I bet this must be really difficult in a context also of extreme right permeability into the agrarian sector and in rural Spain, and where in a context of in Europe where the extreme right has found in the idea of the rural, a forefront to articulate its own agenda. Katie, moving to the case of UK and one of the most financialized economies in the world, and one of at the forefront of water financialization with many companies held by pension funds, investment funds, and another type of investment vehicles. How do you see the future of water in UK and more extensively of urban water?
This is not a small question. Whenever I am asked about the future or what next, then what, those sorts of questions, I always kind of say it would be really easy if we had a single villain in this story, like someone to pin the blame, as if we were in, the Aaron Brockovich film. The problem with a systemic problem like water injustice or any social or environmental justice is that it actually requires a systemic change. That doesn't mean that that's the only thing on the horizon, because there's many steps towards changing things that can be small and incremental that I think are worth exploring. But it also means that we implicate ourselves, as all of us as actors, in water exploitation. And I'll give myself as an example. My pension fund in the UK, which is a pool of money for university lecturers, is the second largest investor in Thames Water, which is the water company that delivers potable water to about 24 million people in London and southeastern England. And Thames Water is currently in the news almost every day and under threat of nationalization because of both its financial practices, which Ug spoke about, and also its role, its very extremely active role in water pollution, spewing massive amounts of untreated raw sewage in the chalk streams of southeastern England and in the Thames River itself. I think there was a study released that there's not a single river or stream in England that has unhealthy fecal coliform bacteria levels, meaning that if you go swimming in it, you'll get sick. And I actually know many people who have. This is a huge issue. we're 30 years into Margaret Thatcher's experiment of fully privatizing water companies with the idea that this would deliver a more efficient, better product. And what it's given us is a country floating in its own shit. And the problem is of course, in a twisted way, my future, meaning my retirement, is directly tied to the future of Thames Water. The pension fund is the second largest investor. And frankly, my future is also tied into this debt-driven water governance model that's what the UK, or England specifically, has been an innovator in as a model of proper utility management. So it's really difficult to unspool that. I wish it was just like Nestle, like a big bad corporation we could shake our hands at. But instead, it's the way that money flows now and financialization as a methodology to kind of enable that, means that the problems are not easy to solve. Generally, and you can correct me or stop me whenever I talk about the future, I always reference the place I've probably worked the longest in, which is Mexico City. Imagine a city of 21 million people in an area that was a natural basin. When the Spanish conquistadors came over the mountain, they were amazed. They said, this is the Venice of Latin America. Huge interconnected freshwater lakes, this incredibly a vibrant agroecological system that through time and urbanization, the lakes have disappeared, the city has grown, and they experience the dual crisis of too much water one moment with floods and rainfall and urbanization, and not enough water the next. I have friends who have relatives who get flooded every rainstorm, and yet they don't receive pipe potable water at the same time. So they're living that kind of twin edge of the water crisis. And I always say Mexico City's the future because I also think it's a site of really radical and interesting experimentation in terms of social organization. So I've worked for about 11 years with a group that are rainwater harvesters for potable indirect use within the household. That was once just kind of a ragtag group that now has installed systems in over 100,000 different homes that under Claudia Sheinbaum's administration, when she was the Mexico City mayor, really started to scale it up and bring it into regulation and government programs within the borough governments of Mexico City. That now that she's president, maybe we'll see something in terms of a system or paradigm change in terms of how we deliver water. That doesn't mean that the technological fix is going to solve anything, but I think when you're up against a crisis and thinking about how do we deliver a democratic good water to all of its citizens, kind of imagining a different modality from the way we've done it before is probably a question worth asking. So in many ways, I continue to work in Mexico City, not only because I have good relationships there, but because I think it is the sort of future of London in a weird way. It's the future of Barcelona. It's a site where people and economies have been pushed to the limit and folks are having to respond now. Their day zero already came 20 years ago, and they're kind of living and working through the repercussions of that. And I think there's something really important to learn and listen to and from the kinds of people who are experiencing those conditions and how they grapple and work through that.
That's brilliant. I think this vision from non-American, non-European geographies, we should pay much more attention because many times we are too much Eurocentric, right, and Anglo-American centric on our understandings of the water crisis. And as you mentioned, and this is something that for most part of the population in the world is like the water crisis is already there. It has been there for many decades. It's something that we are experiencing now, but it has been daily life for most of the population, and we have to bear in mind. And also, many lessons can be learned from those geographies in terms of alternative technological, even entanglements with technology and different governance schemes that many times go beyond the market and beyond the state, right? Under the idea of commons also, I think it's very productive to engage with the debates on those geographies. And I do think that now it would be nice to open up the floor to everyone who wants to join and chip in. Katie understands perfectly Spanish, so you can directly and even we can try to answer now in Spanish. You can do it in English if you want, but feel free to use the language you want. So the floor was open.
Hola, moltes gràcies. Lògicament, un debat molt interessant. Ràpidament, en relació al tema de Catalunya, Catalunya té necessitat hídrica per dues coses, una gran expansió del turisme, també té molta agricultura i a sobre té indústria. Llavors s'apliquen una sèrie de solucions tecnològiques i podríem dir, d'enginyeria forestal, amb el qual una part d'aquesta enginyeria forestal diu que hi ha masses boscos i que aquests boscos ens prenen l'aigua. Evidentment, el bosc entra en competència amb l'home i entra en competència amb els seus propis rius que genera. No sé fins a quin punt el bosc té la culpa del que l'home està exigint a la natura. L'altre són les desalinitzadores. Llavors, la meva pregunta concreta és com veuen les dos ponents un futur basat en una ideologia antropogènica i tecnològica de la gestió de l'aigua en lloc de ser una visió més naturalista. O sigui, tenim que actuar sobre el medi per canviar-lo per tenir aigua o ens hem d'adaptar al medi amb un decreixement de la nostra activitat sobre el medi. Gràcies.
Gràcies. Li traduiré la pregunta. En Violeta, if you want to start thinking whether we need to push further this idea of controlling the water cycle. No, go.
Vale. Sí, he entendido bien, que mi catalán tampoco es muy bueno. Me estás preguntando entre un futuro enfocado en transformar el medio ambiente para gestionar el agua o un futuro enfocado en adaptarnos a lo que ya tenemos a través de tecnologías, ¿no? Si hay un dilema ahí. Vale, sí. Sí, yo tampoco tengo una posición muy clara en esto. Hay mucha discusión sobre la reforestación y los impactos hidrológicos que tiene. Hay un giro muy claro hacia usar la naturaleza hacia nuestro favor. No me gustan estos términos que estoy usando, porque la propia idea de naturaleza la podríamos discutir aquí mucho, ¿no? Pero esto que se llaman soluciones basadas en la naturaleza es algo que ha llegado para quedarse, que tiene sus aspectos positivos porque sustituye estrategias basadas en grandes infraestructuras como presas, etcétera, pero también puede traer nuevos problemas. Yo personalmente creo que hay que hacer todo lo que se pueda y adaptarnos al entorno, pero también el entorno está muy degradado. O sea, hay que cuidarlo y hay que restaurarlo en muchos casos. Los límites de las tecnologías que tenemos para seguir produciendo agua, pues eso los vamos a ver. Yo creo que podemos seguir desalinizando, pero bueno, eso también tiene sus límites. No todo el mundo puede pagar. La desalinización tiene costes, tiene impactos ambientales, etc. Bueno, no te da una respuesta, pero bueno, igual tú puedes.
I think, is this on? Yes, okay. Thank you for the question. I think oftentimes our first instinct is to look to a technological solution. And I'm not saying technology is bad, but I do kind of think of it as a social scientist, meaning that it really reflects social values, relations, and ideas more than anything. And without a kind of strong consideration of that, you can build all the gadgets and things that you want, but they might be used in ways that are paradoxical, like Violeta talked about. The same Jevons paradox, the idea that more technology will save us, is often true in the domestic world as well, where we have more devices and things that are supposed to help us conserve water, and in fact, our water use goes up overall, our consumption goes up, because we're using more devices that actually use water rather than less. Like the old Luddite technologies in some ways were often the most simple. So it's not that I'm against technological solutions, but even when I work with my collaborators in Mexico City, rainwater harvesting is nothing new. I mean, they've been doing this, the Nahuatl and the Mexica have been doing this in the Mexico City basin for thousands of years before any white people showed up, and before any NGOs started calling it rainwater harvesting. So really, there's some technological improvements, but it really means it won't do much unless we have a kind of paradigm shift in the ways that we relate to each other, across difference, across class, across race, across boundaries, across even human, non-human, different kind of spheres. And I think only when we have that kind of shift can the technology really help us to become more sustainable, in any kind of way. So that's kind of, how I would think about the role of technology and thinking forward through different potential scenarios or solutions. I avoid the word solutions because it sounds like I know the answer to everything, but through different kind of scenarios that I feel like we're walking backwards, forwards, if you will. We're looking back on what we know, but we're trying to move forward in some kind of way, but we might bump into things along the way.
Jo sí, si puc afegir sobre el... Now we will move to Catalan, so we will have the three. Sobre el cas de Catalunya i més de l'estat espanyol, hem de recordar, anant, no sé, els que tingueu ja l'edat, el 2001, Pla Hidrològic Nacional, una de les polítiques públiques que, diguéssim, més ha impactat en la població en termes d'activisme, o sigui, les manifestacions més grans de la història de Barcelona moderna abans del procés les venen de la guerra d'Iraq, però abans del Pla Hidrològic Nacional. El Pla Hidrològic Nacional reflexava de la manera més pura el que els geògrafs anomenen en el cas espanyol el paradigma hidràulic, la idea aquesta de reconfigurar els rius perquè serveixin a les necessitats humanes. Heu de pensar que la idea dels rius com a una unitat ecosistèmica, d'alguna manera, durant aquest modernisme hidràulic que no, evidentment que es pot atribuir al franquisme, però que va als temps de la República i al regeneracionisme espanyol, vull dir que no és quelcom que només vingués, diguéssim, que fos un projecte autàrquic o feixista, sinó que ve de l'ideal aquest de modernitat des de la pèrdua de Cuba, diguéssim. Tot això col·lapsa el 2001 amb la idea del Pla Hidrològic Nacional, que era una obra faraònica que gràcies a l'activisme i també d'alguna manera que Europa va dir que no posaria diners per fer aquesta obra, es va posar en un calaix. Però què va passar després? Tot i la nova cultura de l'aigua, que va ser molt potent, la idea d'aquest tecnosolucionisme o la idea del paradigma hidràulic es va reformular, inclús des d'un punt de vista polític-econòmic. Els mateixos interessos que hi havia darrere les obres dels transvasaments van veure en la dessalació l'oportunitat de canviar perquè res canviés, en el sentit que es van garantir que els rius no es degradarien més i al mateix moment es va trobar una solució de compromís perquè tot el lobby de la construcció que hi havia darrere el Pla Hidrològic Nacional pogués continuar desenvolupant-se i l'aigua arribés als usos més intensius d'agricultura i turístics del tot el llevant de l'estat. En aquest sentit, la dessalació és hereva d'aquest ideal i ara mateix estem
però tampoc és per demonitzar la dessalació. La dessalació ens ha salvat de tindre aigua a les aixetes, ras i curt, si no hauríem tingut restriccions. Vull dir que sense dessaladores ara mateix no tindríem un subministrament molt més precari, perquè penseu que la situació sense dessaladores era la del 2008, quan vam tindre una forta sequera, i la situació pluviomètrica era molt millor que la d'ara. La d'ara ha sigut la pitjor sequera, però no hem patit tant o hem patit el mateix perquè hi ha hagut aquest tecnosolucionisme darrere. O sigui que no vull que m'agafeu la idea que tot és dolent, però senzillament que s'ha d'entendre com aquestes tecnologies encapsulen certs valors i reprodueixen certes dinàmiques del mateix capital. I la idea ara de futur de Catalunya, la idea de futur, i que hi ha com un consens, és fer Catalunya independent del clima, de la pluja. I en el fons les obres que s'estan fent sembla quelcom que fa riure, però en el fons va en aquesta direcció. O sigui, estem fent el sistema de regeneració del Llobregat, s'està fent al Besòs, s'estan fent 2 dessaladores noves, i en un escenari de sequera molt dura es pot tirar directament de dessalació i de regeneració i sostenir el cicle hidrosocial de Barcelona a través de fluxos de capital i fluxos d'energia, perquè evidentment per sostenir aquestes configuracions energèticament necessites molt, però et pots adaptar, i aquí hi ha la diferència de qui es pot adaptar. O sigui, les ciutats del nord global no tindran problemes d'aigua en tant que puguin trobar solucions a aquests tecnofixes en anglès, que no em surt la traducció, però el problema ve quan transposem aquestes realitats al sud global, i com aquestes tecnologies molts cops encara creen illes de privilegi i de... Sorry, because you are not understanding anything, but... Però en aquest sentit, la qüestió tecnològica a vegades la pensem que és una qüestió purament tècnica, i no, encapsula uns valors i unes idees i uns imaginaris que són molt importants d'entendre i de contestar.
But I gave you this. This is my translation.
Vale. Bé, bona tarda. Good afternoon. Hablaré en castellano para que me entiendan bien las dos, espero. Hay una cosa que ha dicho Katy, que el tema de las guerras del agua. Yo entiendo que no, o sea, cuando se habla de guerras del agua, no se está hablando de que vayan a venir unas guerras como las convencionales, ¿no? Con bombas y rifles. Y en realidad se está hablando de guerras más sociales. De hecho, se han producido guerras sociales de este tipo en Bolivia, que ya todos conocemos el tema. Se están produciendo en Francia con los soulèvements de la terre, que están levantando hacia... enfrentándose a temas relacionados con el agua. Entonces yo pienso que en realidad lo que se está produciendo son guerras del activismo social contra las grandes empresas. Todos sabemos que las grandes empresas son las que son las que dominan el mundo, o sea, no nos podemos equivocar. Los políticos en realidad están siguiendo en general los pasos de las grandes economías y son los que les dan las pautas para funcionar, ¿no? Desgraciadamente. Entonces pienso que uno de los problemas graves que puede venir de este tipo de economía, de política, es otro tema. Es que tengo una empanada mental importante, pero porque también está el tema de la financiarización. Y el tema de la financiarización, que no se ha hablado, que ha empezado en California, creo. No sé si has comentado que en Inglaterra, pero lo he entendido mal, pero en California el agua ya es un activo de los bancos y, por lo tanto, esto es un peligro muy importante para todo el mundo, porque a la que se metan estas grandes compañías a hacer del agua un activo financiero, la verdad es que ni el norte ni el sur lo vamos a tener muy claro. O sea que me gustaría conocer vuestra opinión de si realmente vamos hacia ese camino. Yo lo veo muy así, con muy poca esperanza, como decía Violeta, pero la verdad es que estamos dominados por grandes empresas. Aquí en Cataluña lo tenemos clarísimo. Una empresa, Aigua, que depende de Veolia, que es una gran multinacional que está en todo el mundo, en Sudamérica, en todas partes. Gracias. Y muchas gracias por vuestras ponencias, ha sido muy interesante.
Exacto, estoy de acuerdo, entonces ya vamos al bar para una cervecita y no. I'll answer in English because I want to be precise. I think what's interesting, so you diagnose the problem very correctly. And when we begin to think about the political economy of water, again, it's really difficult to pinpoint the villain under a system that is financialized because the money sloshes all over globally. And it brings in, and Ug is a bigger expert than I am on this, but I'll answer and then you could do your riff. It brings in new financial actors into the water sphere that people might not even be aware about, including my colleagues whose pension fund is, at the heart of Thames Water and their activities. When we look at financialization, it mixes in so much globally, mainly from global north countries, but not all from kind of evil corporations like BlackRock or whatever. The biggest investor in Thames Water is the Ontario Public Teachers Union Pension Fund, which is a bunch of social servants out of Ontario, Canada. I think the third or fourth is the Abu Dhabi Sovereign Wealth Fund, and then we get into other kinds of oil wealth funds. But even Ireland raked in the largest tax surplus because it's sort of an offshore haven for many corporations. This past year, it racked in the largest surplus through taxes, and they are creating their own sovereign wealth fund in order to do the same sort of investment in mainly infrastructure, fixed assets, because all of us want pensions when we retire, and fixed assets are a really lucrative and solid, stable, relatively low-risk investment. So once we kind of see this shift towards debt-driven water governance that is in the UK, but also other places as well, whether it's a private utility like in the case of England and Wales, or whether it's a public utility that also works under financialized assets such as in Colombia and other parts of the world, then the sort of how do we undo this and who are the new financial actors that are involved in water governance that might not even know otherwise but have an outside influence or hand, it just becomes really tricky and different. I do think we are in a new phase where governments are running up huge fiscal debts, and this is the kind of one way out by financializing debt, selling debt. And who's making money off that and who isn't, and who's kind of absorbing the negative externalities of that, I think is a lesson that's what England teaches us in terms of who's literally swimming in the sewage and who is benefiting. But it can also be the same person, like myself. My pension benefits, but I also have to deal with water pollution. I can't go swim many places. So I think that's the kind of trickiness and complexity that there isn't necessarily a techno fix for that. That's a very social problem. At the heart of it, the economy is about social values and principles, and how we transform that's more of a political question and struggle. So I mostly agree with you, but I'll pass the mic.
En el Estado español, el agua es un bien de dominio público desde el día 1 de nuestra democracia. Eso es muy importante porque no es así en todos los países. Y por eso podemos hablar de repartir el agua, porque es un bien de dominio público, al menos en el ámbito más agrario. Porque piensas, ¿quién habla hoy de repartir la tierra? Atentar contra la propiedad privada, ¿no? Pero del agua sí se está abriendo esta discusión. Lo que pasa que hay otras maneras de privatizar o de gestionar de manera privada. Especialmente los servicios urbanos pueden tener concesiones de larguísima duración, que es lo que pasa aquí, igual tú puedes expandir, pero también otra manera de acaparar el agua es fondos de inversión que entran a comprar tierras para producir de manera intensiva para exportación y el agua se les da sin más, creando más escasez. Eso también es otra manera de financiarización.
Sí, yo, construyendo en lo que comentaba Violeta, has mencionado el caso de California y sí que, o sea, aquí hay dos diferencias, matices, pero creo que son importantes. Lo que vemos más es la financialización de la infraestructura, no del recurso. En el caso de California es financialización del recurso en tanto que se crea un mercado de futuros del agua donde se puede comprar, igual que con mercado, bueno, como el mercado de emisiones que también puedes comprar a futuro, el mercado del café que te vas en el spot market, o sea, es un mercado regional muy pequeño porque no se expande solo en la geografía de California, pero sí que cambia las lógicas de cómo pensar en el recurso y cómo pensar en su utilización y preservación. Pero volviendo al tema de la infraestructura, el problema aquí y que ¿no? el debate entre ¿no? privatización y financialización es que la financialización, y aquí estoy sobresimplificando, pero añade, o sea, una capa de actores nuevos que tienen unas lógicas de beneficio de extracción que son distintas de las lógicas a las cuales estamos acostumbrados, incluso de las compañías privadas de agua. Para decir un ejemplo, una compañía privada con tradición de 150 años, y no es para defenderla, pero se proyecta en el tiempo y entiende cómo se tiene que invertir, qué tiene que hacer y qué no tiene que hacer para preservar su propio negocio. La perversión del caso de la financialización de la infraestructura, que lo vemos a través del caso inglés, es que hay una entrada-salida de distintos fondos. Por ejemplo, en uno de los fondos que entró al principio en Thames Water era Macquarie, que era un fondo inglés, que si lo buscáis, hay inglés australiano, que se especializa en entrar de distintas infraestructuras, porque el agua, como el agua urbana opera en forma de monopolio natural, tienes unos consumos muy estables, puedes garantizar una serie de beneficios que pueden satisfacer, es un mercado muy maduro y pueden satisfacer a los inversores, ¿no? Pero el problema de estos fondos es que muchas veces entran en las infraestructuras y las sobreextraen rentas hasta el punto, ¿no?, de Thames Water, que en el Financial Times sale día sí, día no, de entrar en una espiral de deuda tan grande, deuda privada, pero que solo el Estado la puede salvar. O sea, la paradoja es que el caso de Thames Water es muy claro, ¿no?, de la espiral de deuda que hace que después de entrar y salir distintos fondos, quede en un estado, ¿no?, que es too big to fail, pero se plantea otra vez una renacionalización, pero una renacionalización que es básicamente una socialización de las pérdidas, no un control democrático sobre el recurso, ¿no? Y aquí está el matiz y la perversión y creo que también que los movimientos sociales del agua, ¿no?, muchas veces se han focalizado en la cuestión de privatización y entender los matices de que no todos los actores tienen las mismas lógicas y los mismos impactos en los ciclos hidrosociales. Creo que es muy relevante y el caso inglés ilumina mucho, ¿no?, en este aspecto. Ya quedan 2 minutos.
Hola. There was a recent John Oliver episode about the farmer misallocation along the Colorado River. Maybe one of you can contextualize that a bit more, and then I wanted to know if either of you guys are working with that and more about the global policy, if that is unique to Southwest America or it's also an issue in the rest of the world.
I don't have cable TV, and while I like John Oliver, I did not see this episode, so maybe you could give us a little more context.
Basically, the farmers along the river, they get a yearly allocation of water, and if they don't use the full allocation, they get less the following year, so they're misincentivized.
Welcome to Western American water law under prior appropriation. The legal doctrine that you're referring to is called the use it or lose it beneficial use doctrine. That's part of the Western, more or less the Western states of the United States water law, which ironically comes out of gold mining in the 1860s. That's literally where this legal system that the Supreme Court adjudicates cases on originally emerged from. But there's two principal things that underpin Western water law in the US. One is first in time, first in right, meaning senior water rights holders enshrined in time have priority over junior water rights holders. So obviously if you were there first, you have priority even in a drought. Junior water rights holders have to accede to the senior water rights. And the other is the beneficial use doctrine, which, yeah, that sounds really funny, except it's actually really serious, and it shapes not only prior appropriation as a legal doctrine and system, but the fact that many countries through US imperialism and domination have integrated some of these principles in their own legal laws. Chile is a great example of the 1981 Water Code, which was a really extreme example of full privatization of water rights in order to create a market where you detached water from land and you could buy and sell water rights under the authoritarian government of Pinochet. And a lot of that, those people who developed that system went to the Chicago School, learned about law and economics, learned about prior appropriation, and came back and sort of instituted a model under a military dictatorship that lasted until recent years when Chileans have said, yeah, no, and have been starting to renegotiate not just all of the Constitution, but parts of the national water regulatory framework and the legal principles behind that. So yeah, it's funny, John Oliver is great, la la la, but it's actually really serious at the same time, and it does kind of form the backbone of water law in the US West, which sounds crazy, but actually incentivizes waste. And if you try to do anything to the contrary, such as give a natural ecosystem rights to water, you'll be shot down by court rulings. The only kind of crack in that are recent cases under indigenous water rights, native nations and tribes that are under the US law federal sovereign territories, meaning that they're sovereign governments that negotiate with a US federal government, have finally won in certain cases such as the Klamath Basin in southern Oregon, the rights to assert, we were here first, before y'all white people, we have senior water rights. And so they're able to kind of break in and overturn some of the rulings in order to, in the case of the Klamath Basin, stop over-extraction and farming and start to let the river run all year long in order to have salmon fishing. Kind of in a way, using indigenous water rights as rights for nature. That's probably the only case in the US where I've begun to see prior appropriation really shifting and changing.
D'acord, em sembla que ja estem per sobre el temps. Voldria agrair a la Violeta, a la Katie, les seves meravelloses intervencions i a tots vosaltres per haver vingut. Moltes gràcies.